You're listening to Seizure Adventure, the podcast that shares stories of adventure and outdoor living with epilepsy. Hello adventurers, Fran here, and I am back with what's going to be a super quick episode for you today. And it's something that I've been meaning to talk about for a little while, but I recently had an email come into my inbox that has reminded me about the subject. The epilepsy and adventure crossover is such a niche area. And because Seizure Adventure is currently the only place dedicated to that crossover, I do get a lot of people contacting me. Most often it is people who have adventurous souls and lived and breathed their sports, and then they started having seizures and get given this diagnosis of epilepsy. I am honoured to be the one that these people speak to, and I appreciate the trust it takes to reach out to me and the hope that Seizure Adventure can provide. I do my best to merit that trust, and I do as much research as I can. I speak to as many people as possible. But the question I get asked most is, can I do this sport with epilepsy? I know some of you listening to this have actually asked that very question to me, and you'll know that no matter what the sport is, even if it's something I'm very familiar with, my answer is always going to be the same. I cannot tell you. But I do promise that I will always do my best to try and help you decide for yourself. Quite often, my help is signposting you towards someone else with epilepsy who has more experience of that sport. Sometimes it is gleaning information from guidelines set out either by sports authorities or epilepsy groups, and sometimes other people actually send me something useful that I can share. For about a year now, I've been talking to a gentleman called Ian Johnston, who, after being diagnosed with epilepsy himself at 48, stopped playing sport. Now, I am going to be speaking to Ian in a future episode, so I won't go into his story too much today. But Ian has been doing a master's degree, and he got in touch with me because his dissertation was looking into the relationship between epilepsy and sport. And now he's coming to the end of his course. He recently sent me an email with some of the research that he's been doing and a very valuable resource from the International League Against Epilepsy, or ILAE. And I really wish that I'd known about this sooner because it's 2 tables that clearly lay out some guidelines around all kinds of sports, including some adventure sports. The first table is about seizure risk levels in sport, and its label is Categorization of Sports by Level of Risk of Injury or Death for Persons with Epilepsy or for Bystanders should a seizure occur during the event. So obviously a lot of people would get focused on the idea of risk of injury or death here, but this is a table which goes into detail of 3 different groups of sports. Group 1 are sports with no significant additional risk. Group 2 are sports with moderate risk to the persons with epilepsy, but not to bystanders. And Group 3 sports are high risk for people with epilepsy, and for some of the sports, it could be high risk for bystanders as well. Now, the second table is about whether these sports are recommended by the type of seizure that somebody has. So on one side, it has the 3 groups, so no significant additional risk, moderate risk, and high risk. And then it also has the type of seizure or the symptoms of the seizure. So if you have a single unprovoked seizure, how much risk that would be. Sleep-related seizures only, seizures with impaired awareness. And it also goes into things like if you are on medication withdrawal, or if you've had your epilepsy resolved. So no seizures for more than 10 years and you're off of any epilepsy medication. Now, these tables are very clearly laid out, and there are a couple of things that made me particularly excited about them. The first thing that made me excited was that there were a number of adventure sports on there which are unusual enough that they don't usually feature on most advice web pages. So things like NHS or Epilepsy Action often have advice on standard sports like swimming, running, cycling, but a lot of the other adventure sports are often left off. This table goes into more detail, so you have things like dancing is on there. That's a no significant additional risk sport. You have canoeing, archery, shooting, skating, snowboarding. They all fall into the moderate risk category. And you have other sports which we would call extreme, so things like climbing, diving, solitary sailing is on there, and all of those ones fall into the group of high risk for people with epilepsy. Some of the sports there might also be dangerous for bystanders, for example, aviation or motorsports. The second thing that made me happy when looking at these two tables was the fact that none of the sports fell into a category called absolutely no way, never, or something maybe a bit more scientific than that. The closest the advice gets to a no is where it says generally barred, but may be considered with restrictions at neurologist's discretion for sports posing no risk to bystanders. And there is still that caveat there, at the neurologist's discretion, so long as something isn't posing a risk to anybody other than the person with epilepsy. I recently went to speak to my neurology nurse for my 6-month catch-up. And when we were talking, we obviously went into detail about how I was feeling, any symptoms, but we also talked about a number of things, including the hiking I did in Colorado and the ultra run. And we talked about staying safe, but also about the importance of quality of life. If you are having seizures and a neurologist says to you, you shouldn't do a sport, you should absolutely listen to them and talk to them about the reasons why they are advising against it. But if you love skiing, climbing, hiking, surfing, running, whatever it is that you love, don't be afraid to make them listen to you as well. Ask them if there is any discretion to be had. Work together, figure out compromises, and you can use resources like these tables from the ILAE to come to a decision. Those tables will be available on the Seizure Adventure website, so do head to them for reference. And obviously you can refer to them when you're speaking to your neurologist. That is it. I'll be signing off for today's episode, and it's very apt to say this time, safe adventures, everyone.